Welcome to Dark History for Sleep. Tonight we descend into the cold stone halls of a forgotten castle, where blood ran in basins and screams echoed through velvet-draped corridors. This is the true story of Elizabeth Báthory, Countess of Hungary. To some, she was a misunderstood woman, to others a political scapegoat. But to the terrified villagers beneath her estate, she was a predator, and to history, she may be the most prolific female serial killer ever known. She was born in 1560 into the Báthory family, one of the most powerful and feared noble bloodlines in Eastern Europe. Her lineage included warlords, princes, and the King of Poland. Her cousins ruled Transylvania. Her uncles practiced black magic. Her aunts dabbled in Satanism. And from a young age, Elizabeth showed signs of darkness. She was brilliant, fluent in Latin, German, and Hungarian before age 10. But she also suffered from uncontrollable rages and violent seizures. One record suggests she witnessed a man being sewn inside a dead horse as punishment. Another claims she laughed as a servant was beaten for dropping a pin. At 15, she was married to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a ruthless soldier known as the Black Knight of Hungary. Together they moved into Kaktic Castle, a looming fortress nestled in the Carpathian foothills, isolated, heavily guarded, and soon to become infamous. Ferenc was often away at war, fighting the Ottomans. Alone, Elizabeth ruled his lands. She judged disputes, imposed taxes, punished peasants, and hired a private retinue of servants and healers, some of them witches, alchemists, and women rumored to drink animal blood for strength. Outside the castle walls, Hungary was collapsing. The 16th century was a hellscape of superstition, plague, and endless war. The nobility grew fat on stolen wealth, while peasants starved in the fields. Women disappeared. Families remained silent, because to accuse the Countess was to invite ruin. And within the walls of Kaktic, Elizabeth's behavior grew darker. Strange cries echoed at night. Servants were dismissed and never seen again. Local girls sent to train at the castle simply vanished. But no one spoke out. Not yet. Because the higher you climbed in power, the harder it was to fall. And Elizabeth Báthory was standing at the edge of a very long fall. Kaktic Castle wasn't just a residence. It was a fortress. Thick stone walls rose above jagged cliffs. Its dungeons, cut directly into the rock, were said to be bottomless. The locals whispered that witches met there under moonlight, and that wolves would howl before a girl disappeared. Inside, Elizabeth's days were a theater of wealth. She wore dresses woven with silver thread. She held court surrounded by handmaidens. Musicians played while servants brought platters of fruit and blood-red wine. But in private, that theater turned grotesque. She'd grown obsessed with youth. According to legend, one day a servant girl brushed her hair too hard. Elizabeth slapped her, so hard the girl's nose bled. Some say that when Elizabeth wiped the blood from her own hand, she thought her skin looked smoother, and something twisted took root. She began demanding more, not just obedience but flesh. Servants were stripped naked and whipped until the floor turned slick. Girls were made to stand in freezing water until they collapsed. Some were smeared with honey and tied to trees, to be eaten alive by insects. And these weren't wartime rumors. Multiple surviving testimonies, later taken from her own staff, describe a private torture chamber, a room with iron maidens, spiked cages, pincers, branding irons, a place where screams echoed down stone halls and silence followed only after death. But Elizabeth wasn't alone in her horrors. She had accomplices, a nursemaid named Dorothea Zentes. a supposed witch named Anna Darvulia, a dwarf servant named Fichko, and several handmaidens, each more loyal than the last. Together they created a system. Girls were lured from villages with promises of work, brought to the castle, never seen again. And the worst part? It wasn't a secret. Nobles joked about her cruelty. Priests turned away. She was, after all, a Báthory. And no one punished a Báthory. Not yet. By the late 1590s, Elizabeth Báthory had developed a hunger she could not hide. The castle filled with new maids, chamber girls, seamstresses, young, poor, and easily replaced. Parents were told their daughters had taken positions of honor. Few questioned it. Even fewer dared to ask. The tortures escalated. Girls were forced to eat their own flesh, or each other's. Needles were driven under fingernails, mouths sewn shut with thread. Some victims were made to lie in snow, then doused with water until their skin cracked and bled. Others were burned with heated coins pressed to their feet, their screams muffled by cloth soaked in urine and blood. And through it all, Elizabeth remained regal, untouched, detached. She would sit in her chamber with a goblet of wine, watching the agony like it was theater. Sometimes she participated, biting chunks of flesh from her victims, or scratching their eyes with a golden pin. One surviving witness later testified that Elizabeth laughed like a child when the girls cried for their mothers. Then came the baths. Whether she truly bathed in blood is debated, but the legends began here, when villagers whispered of blood being collected, filtered, and poured into marble basins. Her skin, they said, grew paler. Her youth returned. She was no longer merely cruel. She was ritualistic. Every punishment, every scream, every body was part of a pattern. But power breeds arrogance. And Elizabeth made a critical mistake. She began killing noble daughters. Until now, her victims had been peasants, unprotected, voiceless. But when she expanded her hunt to include daughters of minor nobility, the silence broke. Letters were sent. A priest refused to bury a girl without explanation, and at the royal court of King Matthias II, a shadow of suspicion began to form, one that would grow into a noose. In the winter of 1609, the rumors reached Vienna. Noble families, those with influence, were missing daughters. Quiet inquiries led to terrifying stories. Letters from desperate parents, servants who had seen basins of blood, witnesses who fled Kaktich and never returned. The Hungarian crown could no longer look away. King Matthias II ordered an official inquiry, assigning Gheorghe Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, to investigate. Thurzo wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was Elizabeth's cousin. And in the tangled web of noble politics that made him both dangerous and ideal, he had the rank to confront her and the motive to silence her. He began quietly. Over 300 witnesses and servants were questioned across the region. The stories were grotesquely consistent. Some had seen dozens of corpses buried near the castle. Others spoke of a ledger written by Elizabeth herself, listing the names of over 600 dead girls. A midwife described being forced to stitch open wounds without anesthetic. A former servant claimed to have watched girls strangled with silk scarves and fed to pigs. But hearsay wasn't enough. Thurzo needed proof, so on December the 29th, 1610, he rode to Cactus Castle with soldiers. What he found inside would pass into legend. The gates were open, the halls silent, and in the courtyard, several fresh corpses lay discarded in the snow, some naked, some still bleeding. Inside, half-dead girls were chained to walls. Others were locked in windowless rooms, blindfolded and covered in wounds. Elizabeth Báthory was arrested on the spot. But she did not scream. She did not protest. She looked at her cousin and asked, "Do you know how many families will be disgraced if I speak?" It was not the plea of a madwoman. It was the warning of a woman who had never, until that moment, believed she could be touched. Elizabeth Báthory's arrest sent shockwaves through Hungary. A noble woman, a countess, a cousin to kings, accused not of treason or theft, but of industrialized murder. The case was unprecedented. But even more chilling was the question whispered behind closed doors. How long had everyone known? The answer was clear. For years, priests had refused to comment. Local officials had been paid off. Other nobles had looked away, or sent their daughters into her hands, hoping for patronage or favor. Now it all unraveled. The king wanted justice. The church wanted absolution. But the nobility, they wanted silence. Because if Elizabeth was tried and executed publicly, others would fall with her. Her accomplices, her enablers, her protectors, even the crown itself might be implicated. So a compromise was reached. Elizabeth would not stand trial. She would never face public judgment. Instead, her accomplices would be sacrificed. Dorothea, Fitzko, and the others were arrested, tortured, interrogated. Their testimonies were horrific. They described hundreds of murders. They gave names, dates, locations. They explained how Elizabeth would bite chunks of flesh, how she would sew mouths shut, how she kept girls alive for days, just to see how long they could suffer. And still, no formal charges were laid against her. Elizabeth Báthory, the most prolific female killer in recorded history, was instead sentenced to house arrest, not in a manor, in her own castle. Her punishment, to be bricked inside her chambers. A small slit left for air. Food passed through a narrow hole. No contact, no light. Just the sound of stone, locking her away forever. Or so they hoped. Because legends don't die in silence. Elizabeth's cell was a tomb. They sealed her behind stone, 3 layers thick. No visitors, no court, no trial. Only rumors. The guards claimed she spoke to shadows, that she laughed at night, that she recited names, hundreds of names, like prayers or curses, and the outside world moved on. Her accomplices were executed. One burned at the stake, another had her fingers torn off with hot pincers before she was strangled. But Elizabeth? She lingered. For 4 years, she remained behind the walls of Kachtitz, writing letters to the king, requesting mercy, offering silence. Historians today debate whether she truly kept a diary, listing 650 victims, or whether it was fabricated by her enemies. Some argue she was innocent, that she was the victim of a political purge, that noble men, threatened by a wealthy and powerful widow, conspired to destroy her, that the blood-soaked myths were exaggerated. But if that's true, what of the bodies? What of the bones unearthed near the castle? What of the hundreds of consistent testimonies? And what of the letters from villagers, decades before her arrest, pleading for help? On August 21st, 1614, the guards checked the slit in the stone. Elizabeth Báthory was lying on her side, motionless, dead. No priest attended her, no ceremony was held. She was buried in secret, first near the castle, then quietly moved to her family crypt. No marker bears her name. Only the legacy remains. A legend of blood, a name whispered in horror, and a question left unanswered. Was she a monster, or just the only one ever punished? Elizabeth Báthory's crimes did not begin in darkness. They began in daylight, under the guise of noble responsibility. She established a finishing school at Countess Castle, a place where young girls from noble but poor families could be educated, groomed, elevated. Parents sent their daughters willingly. They arrived by carriage, dressed in fine linen, hopeful. They thought they were entering a life of privilege. They were entering a slaughterhouse. At first, the girls were told to clean, to cook, to serve. Then they were isolated, told they were disobedient, told they had sinned, told they needed discipline, and then came the punishments. One girl was stripped naked, smeared with honey, and tied to the castle roof, left for the sun and insects. Another had red-hot irons pressed to her breasts for speaking out of turn. Others were locked in coffins lined with spikes. Some were sewn into their own dresses, the thread piercing skin with every move. Witnesses said Elizabeth sang while she tortured, that she would dress in black lace, coat her lips with pigment, and dance as the girls screamed. She wasn't just inflicting pain, she was performing it. And through it all, her staff enabled her. They held the girls down. They brought more when one died. They lied to villagers. They disposed of the bodies, burning them, burying them in the gardens, or tossing them down wells. They kept a system running, a system designed for suffering. One maid escaped. She reached a nearby village, barefoot and bleeding, and told her story. But when the mayor came to investigate, he was offered a bribe. And when he refused, he was never seen again. Because this wasn't just about cruelty. It was about power. And in 16th century Hungary, power could bury the truth as easily as it buried the dead. Over time, the scale of the killings grew. At first it was one girl a month, then it was one a week, then one every few days. Witnesses would later describe blood pooling in the hallways, soaking into stone that could never be cleaned. The stench of rot lingered in the lower chambers. Servants worked in shifts, some disposing of corpses, others scrubbing walls with lye and ash. But no matter how many were taken, more always came. Because Elizabeth Báthory had power, she had land, she had the blessing of the court, and perhaps most terrifying of all, she had no fear of consequence. She began experimenting. Girls were placed in ice baths, then beaten until they fractured. Some were cut open slowly, bit by bit, to see how long they would survive. One was reportedly forced to cook and eat part of her own thigh before she died. And through it all, Elizabeth kept records, painstaking, handwritten notes. Some scholars believe a ledger was found, containing over 600 names, each girl catalogued, each death recorded. But the cruelty wasn't just physical, it was psychological. She forced some girls to kill each other, offering freedom to the survivor. Others were made to smile and thank her after every lash. She stripped them of identity, then of dignity, then of life. And as the castle filled with blood, the surrounding nobility turned a blind eye. Because Elizabeth Báthory was a countess, a widow, a landowner, to confront her was to risk war between noble families. So the girls kept dying. And the silence grew louder. There's a reason Elizabeth's crimes weren't stopped sooner. It wasn't just fear, it was politics. You see, Hungary in the early 1600s was caught between empires. The Ottoman Turks pressed from the south. The Habsburgs watched from Vienna. And inside the kingdom, the aristocracy operated like a collection of small warlords. Elizabeth Báthory was one of the most powerful. She owned vast estates, controlled multiple villages, commanded the loyalty of minor nobles, and her husband's death had only expanded her independence. So when rumors of her cruelty reached the courts, nobles hesitated, not because they didn't believe them, but because they did. And if they acted, if they brought her to justice, it would set a dangerous precedent, that a noblewoman could be punished like a peasant. And that was unacceptable. Some tried subtler means. A bishop wrote to her, warning of excommunication. She ignored him. A neighboring noble stopped sending his daughters to her finishing school. She sent him a gift of rare spices, a veiled threat, and the silence returned. But inside the castle, her methods became more experimental, more theatrical. She began using heated branding irons, shaping symbols into flesh. Some girls were burned in the shape of crosses, others marked with her initials. A few were allegedly preserved, kept in underground chambers, barely alive, more art than human. It wasn't just cruelty now. It was control. She wasn't killing for pleasure alone. She was building something, a legacy. And in her twisted view, that legacy was written in skin and screams. By 1608, the killing had become systematic. Elizabeth didn't just commit the murders, she delegated them. Her inner circle now functioned like a death cult. Fitzko, the deformed servant, was said to lure girls with lies and gifts. Ilona Jo, a handmaiden, would oversee punishments, passing Elizabeth her tools like a surgeon's assistant. Dorothea Sentes managed the burial grounds, recording shallow graves behind the castle and burning what couldn't be buried. Anna Darvulia, the old healer and rumored witch, was the darkest of them all. It was she who taught Elizabeth to avoid the waste of fast deaths, to use starvation, bloodletting, prolonged freezing, methods that could stretch agony into days. She was said to chant while the girls screamed, some spell of protection or perhaps power. And the castle itself changed. Rooms once meant for guests were refitted with chains. Basins installed beneath floorboards to collect blood, hooks mounted to the rafters. The line between house and hell was gone. Elizabeth now believed herself untouchable. At one feast, she allegedly struck a maid with a knife in front of a visiting noble. When the man protested, she laughed and said, "You think she feels more pain than a rabbit skinned for your plate?" He said nothing more, because he wanted to leave alive. But not everyone stayed silent. A young priest began recording whispered reports. A maid escaped, badly wounded, and reached another village, warning a local bishop. And when a minor noble's daughter was returned home in a sealed box, missing her tongue and fingers, the whispers turned into outrage. It was the beginning of the end. The walls around Elizabeth's impunity were cracking, and beneath them, the dead were beginning to speak. As pressure mounted, Elizabeth Báthory made a critical misstep. She began to accelerate the killings. Some believe it was fear, an instinct that her time was running out. Others think it was obsession, a descent into compulsion. Whatever the reason, her cruelty became reckless. She no longer waited for secrecy. Girls were murdered in broad daylight. Some were dragged from villages in front of weeping parents. Servants complained openly, only to be silenced or disappear. The castle staff shrank. The bodies increased, and the locals, once too afraid to speak, began to act. Anonymous letters arrived at the court in Pressburg, detailed, specific, and consistent. Descriptions of girls chained to beds, flayed alive, drained of blood into ceremonial basins, of children found nailed to walls, of cries that echoed through the Carpathian hills long after midnight. King Matthias II, under increasing public scrutiny, could no longer delay. He summoned György Thurzo again, the Palatine of Hungary. This time, it was not a quiet inquiry. This was a raid. On December 29th, 1610, Thurzo and his men arrived at Kaktitz Castle. They were expecting resistance. What they found was far worse. The gates stood open, no guards, the air heavy with iron and rot. Inside, in a side room, they found a girl dead on the floor, blood congealing beneath her. Another was dying, limbs bound, skin blistered with burns. Further in, 3 more girls were chained to a wall, barely breathing. Thurzo entered Elizabeth's chambers and found her calmly writing letters. She did not resist. She looked at him, smiled, and said, "You're late." Then she turned her gaze toward the chained girls and whispered, "They weren't innocent." The castle was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. Thurzo ordered his men to search every room, every cellar, every stable. They found bones buried behind the stables, some half-burned, others gnawed by animals. A pile of discarded garments, blood-stained silk, shredded petticoats, embroidered sleeves too small for women, meant for children. They found a ledger, scrawled in Elizabeth's hand, with entries that matched names given by villagers, many marked with a small cross, dead. The townspeople gathered at the gates, silent and wide-eyed. Some stared in disbelief, others wept. A few just watched with grim vindication. Inside, Elizabeth was placed under arrest, but not in chains. She was a Báthory. Even now, the nobility feared the political fallout of treating her like a common criminal. Instead, she was escorted to her private quarters, placed under guard. Her accomplices, however, were not so lucky. Ficzko, Ilona, Dorothea. They were dragged before a tribunal, tortured for days, and forced to confess. Each gave horrifying, detailed testimony, how they kept the girls alive as long as possible, how Elizabeth ordered them to beat, slice, and bite, how the Countess insisted on watching the light leave each girl's eyes. They described her obsession with blood, how she believed it kept her young, how she whispered to herself in Latin, calling on demons, how she referred to her victims not as girls, but as flesh to be corrected, and when asked why they helped her, they simply said, "Because she told us to." With the evidence mounting, the Crown had a decision to make: justice or damage control. And in a world ruled by dynasties and appearance, the choice was already made. Elizabeth Báthory would never see a trial, because the truth was too monstrous, and the scandal far too dangerous. January 1611. The snow outside Kaktitz Castle was thick and gray. Inside the great hall of the nearby town of Bitcha, Elizabeth Báthory's accomplices were brought before the royal tribunal. The Countess herself was absent. She would never appear in court, never hear the charges read, never speak a word in her own defense. But those who had served her, the hands that held the knives, the lips that whispered her orders, were sacrificed to public spectacle. The trial lasted 2 days. Dozens of witnesses, village priests, former servants, nobles who admitted under oath that they had heard rumors but dismissed them, and the accomplices confessed everything. Ilona Jo described hanging girls from rafters by their wrists until their shoulders dislocated. Ficzko claimed Elizabeth once tried to sew a girl's mouth shut with iron wire, only stopping when the girl bled out. Dorothea Sentes described ritual-like procedures, freezing water baths, heated branding, a spiked cage in which girls were made to dance themselves to death. Each described hundreds of murders, but without Elizabeth present, the court focused on them. Ilona and Dorothea were sentenced to have their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers, then burned alive. Fichko was beheaded. And Elizabeth? She remained in her castle. The king faced a dilemma. Executing her could enrage the Báthory family and trigger unrest among the aristocracy. So she was bricked into her rooms, confined to a set of chambers sealed with stone. A small opening allowed in food and air. No visitors, no court, no final statement, just silence. A calculated disappearance. The official record declared her detained until further notice. But unofficially, she was buried alive. And for 4 long years, Elizabeth Báthory sat behind walls she could not see past, while the world outside pretended nothing had happened. Cactus Castle became a tomb. The once lively halls were silent, the servants gone, the guests banished. And behind a sealed wall, Elizabeth Báthory sat in darkness. It wasn't a dungeon, it was a noble prison, her own bedchamber sealed with mortar and stone. A slit carved into the wall allowed food to pass through. Another thinner opening brought in a whisper of light. No books, no letters, just stone and silence. Some say she went mad, that she spoke to invisible attendants, that she wept into her gowns, that she tried to scratch through the walls with her fingernails until they bled. Others say she remained lucid, that she continued to write letters to the king, protesting her innocence. One letter survives. In it, she demands release, not out of fear, but out of entitlement. She refers to the accusations as slander. The victims, dishonorable peasants. The confessions, coerced. But no one replied. Her name had been erased from court records. Her family, ashamed or complicit, remained silent. The world moved on. Outside, the Báthory estates were quietly redistributed. Her fortune was absorbed by relatives, and Cactus was left to rot. Inside the walls, Elizabeth kept counting. According to one account, she scratched tally marks into stone, hundreds of them. Some say they represented the days. Others believe they marked her victims. On the morning of August 21st, 1614, the guard received no response at the food slit. They broke open the wall. Elizabeth Báthory was found lying on her side, eyes open, dead. No autopsy, no final words, just a body and a legacy soaked in myth. She was buried in secret. Her grave remains unmarked. And yet centuries later, her name still echoes. Báthory, witch, countess, killer, or something worse. Cactus Castle became a tomb. The once lively halls were silent. The servants gone, the guests banished. And behind a sealed wall, Elizabeth Báthory sat in darkness. It wasn't a dungeon, it was a noble prison, her own bedchamber, sealed with mortar and stone. A slit carved into the wall allowed food to pass through. Another thinner opening brought in a whisper of light. No books, no letters, just stone and silence. Some say she went mad, that she spoke to invisible attendants, that she wept into her gowns, that she tried to scratch through the walls with her fingernails until they bled. Others say she remained lucid, that she continued to write letters to the king, protesting her innocence. One letter survives. In it, she demands release, not out of fear, but out of entitlement. She refers to the accusations as slander. The victims, dishonorable peasants. The confessions, coerced. But no one replied. Her name had been erased from court records. Her family, ashamed or complicit, remained silent. The world moved on. Outside, the Báthory estates were quietly redistributed. Her fortune was absorbed by relatives, and Cactus was left to rot. Inside the walls, Elizabeth kept counting. According to one account, she scratched tally marks into stone, hundreds of them. Some say they represented the days. Others believe they marked her victims. On the morning of August 21st, 1614, the guard received no response at the food slit. They broke open the wall. Elizabeth Báthory was found lying on her side, eyes open, dead. No autopsy, no final words, just a body and a legacy soaked in myth. She was buried in secret. Her grave remains unmarked, and yet centuries later, her name still echoes. Báthory, witch, countess, killer, or something worse. For most criminals, death is the end. But for Elizabeth Báthory, death was only the beginning of her legend. Almost immediately, stories began to shift. From trial records to folk horror, from whispered warnings to vampire myths, villagers claimed her ghost still wandered Cactiche at night. That blood oozed from the castle walls, that you could still hear girls screaming in the wind, and most famously, that Elizabeth had bathed in the blood of virgins to retain her youth. This story would become her legacy. And though historians doubt the literal truth of the bloodbaths, the symbolic horror remains. A noblewoman so obsessed with power, so insulated by privilege, that she believed herself beyond mortality. And maybe in some ways, she was. Because while her accomplices were burned, her records destroyed, her family shamed, Elizabeth Báthory became immortal in another way. She entered legend, the Blood Countess, the female Dracula, the dark mother of horror. In Gothic literature, she appears as a vampire. In feminist theory, as a symbol of repressed rage. In horror films, a woman cloaked in crimson, bathing in the lifeblood of innocence. Her story is retold, reinterpreted, repackaged, but always with one core truth, that behind her titles, her fortune, her gowns, and her lineage was a human being capable of unimaginable cruelty, and a society that allowed it. Because while the world still speaks her name, we often forget the hundreds of names she silenced, and perhaps that is the truest horror of all. What do we do with a legacy like Elizabeth Báthory's? For centuries, her name has been twisted and recycled, more myth than woman. But when you strip away the legends, the vampire tales, the bloodbaths, the supernatural whisperings, what remains is far more disturbing. A powerful noblewoman, raised in violence, surrounded by privilege. A woman who operated with total impunity, protected by her bloodline and wealth, and a society so stratified, so unequal, that hundreds of girls could vanish, and no one would act. Her victims weren't just nameless peasants. They were daughters, sisters, friends, taken under the pretense of opportunity, erased under the cover of silence. The church looked away. The courts stayed silent. Even her own family turned a blind eye until the damage was too vast to hide. And when justice finally came, it wasn't to right a wrong. It was to preserve the hierarchy. She wasn't executed. She wasn't exiled. She was sealed away like a shameful relic, hidden, contained, erased, except in whispers and folklore. Elizabeth Báthory's story is not just about murder. It's about how power protects itself, how those at the top are allowed to consume those below, literally and metaphorically, until someone dares to speak. And even then, justice is selective. That silence, that complicity, is the real monster here. And it still echoes, not just in castles and graveyards, But in every system where privilege shields brutality, the woman is dead. But the myth lives. Elizabeth Báthory's transformation into a Gothic icon began not with a scream, but with a quill. By the 18th century, her story had been rewritten, first in letters, then in pamphlets, then in romantic novels. She became not a war criminal, but a cursed beauty, damned to feed on blood, a vampire countess, a dark queen betrayed by jealous men, a tragic figure more seductress than butcher. And over time, the facts blurred. The torture chambers became metaphors, the victims, props, the horror, entertainment. In the 19th century, Báthory inspired authors like Bram Stoker and Sheridan Le Fanu. Though Dracula is famously based on Vlad the Impaler, elements of Báthory, her femininity, her obsession with youth, her blood rituals, became central to the vampire mythos. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, she was reborn again. In horror films, in metal lyrics, in perfumes named after her, in YouTube makeup tutorials titled "Bathing in Blood, Get the Báthory Look." From war criminal to Gothic fashion. How did that happen? Because we romanticize monsters we don't understand, and we love a villain who dresses well, especially if she's beautiful, especially if she's rich, especially if she's dead. But Elizabeth Báthory was not fiction. She was not misunderstood. She was not a myth. She was a real woman whose cruelty wasn't fed by curses or bloodlust, but by power without consequence. And power, unchecked, unchallenged, unpunished, is always hungry. There's something seductive about turning killers into legends. It gives us distance. If Elizabeth Báthory was a vampire, a witch, or a cursed immortal, then her crimes don't feel real. They become folklore. They become safe. But real evil doesn't come with fangs or crimson gowns. It comes with legal immunity. It wears the clothes of aristocracy. It hides behind estate walls and diplomatic silence. And Elizabeth Báthory had all of those. The vampire myth began centuries after her death, but the symbolism fit so well because it reflected a deeper truth. She didn't need to drink blood to steal life. She already fed on youth, on fear, on obedience. She bathed in silence. She dined on complicity. The myth of the Blood Countess isn't dangerous because it exaggerates. It's dangerous because it distracts. It replaces victims with aesthetic. It swaps horror for pageantry. It lets us forget the real question. How did she get away with it? And what systems had to exist? What silences had to be kept? What power had to be protected? For a woman to kill hundreds, and never face justice. That question isn't Gothic. It's political. It's historical. It's ongoing. Elizabeth Báthory didn't vanish because her crimes were too shocking. She vanished because they were too inconvenient. And that makes her legacy more relevant than ever. Let's talk about the Ledger, a document allegedly written by Elizabeth herself, listing over 650 victims. Historians still debate whether it existed. Some claim it was fabricated. Others insist it was buried with her records. But the deeper truth, it doesn't matter, because hundreds of names were never recorded at all. Most of her victims were poor, illiterate, voiceless, peasant girls whose families couldn't protest, servants who never returned home, daughters who became missing persons in a world that never cared. There are no monuments for them, no mass grave, no national day of mourning, only court records, only legends, only us. And so Elizabeth's story has become something else, a tale more remembered than understood, filed under horror, tucked beside vampires and black lace, far from the bureaucratic horror it truly was. Because the most terrifying thing about Báthory isn't what she did. It's how she was allowed to do it, year after year, girl after girl, and how even after death, she escaped. No trial, no execution, no accountability, just legend. She became a costume, a metaphor, an icon, but never what she truly was. A warning. So why does her story endure? Why do we still whisper her name? Because Elizabeth Báthory sits at the intersection of every fear we refuse to face. A woman wielding unchecked power, a ruling class consuming the poor, a society that looks the other way until it's too late. And maybe most disturbingly, because she forces us to ask, what would we have done if we lived in one of her villages, if our daughter was summoned to her castle, if we heard the screams at night and told ourselves it was thunder, if we found a body and accepted the bribe, if we were offered protection in exchange for silence? Would we speak? Or would we hide behind the same stone walls that protected her? Because it wasn't just Elizabeth Báthory who built the nightmare. It was the world that let her. Every priest who looked away, every noble who laughed it off, every servant who held down a girl's arms. Evil doesn't exist in isolation. It's fed, enabled, sustained. And when we call her a vampire, we imply she was something other, something inhuman, something from a legend. But she wasn't. She was one of us, a product of her world, and maybe a mirror for ours. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's this: power protects itself. Elizabeth Báthory did not kill in secret. She was not some hidden monster in the shadows. She operated in the open, surrounded by staff, family, clergy, and aristocrats. And the only reason she was ever stopped was because she got sloppy. Because she started killing the wrong girls, those with noble blood, those whose families had influence. Because she crossed a line drawn not by morality, but by class. Had she kept her horrors confined to peasants and servants, she might never have been caught. And so the question isn't, how did she get away with it? It's, how many others did too? How many more castles, how many more chambers, how many more ledgers disappeared beneath history's silence? Because Elizabeth Báthory may have been one of the worst, but she was not alone. Her legacy lives not just in the horror genre, not just in legend, but in the quiet knowledge that when the powerful decide who is disposable, there is no limit to what they'll do, and no shame in how they hide it. There's a cruel irony in how we remember her. Elizabeth Báthory is immortal not because of who she was, but because of who she killed. The girls, forgotten, their names lost, their stories erased, except as props in hers. She became legend. They became background noise. That's how power rewrites history. It centers itself. It makes its violence palatable. It turns mass murder into gothic romance. It reframes suffering as symbolism. But tonight, as you listen, let that myth unravel. Forget the vampire. Forget the corsets and candles. Forget the seductive villainy of the Blood Countess. Remember this instead. She was a woman of unimaginable privilege, who orchestrated hundreds of brutal deaths, who was protected by her bloodline, who faced no trial, who died behind walls she helped build, and who has been remembered far more than the people she destroyed, not because she was extraordinary, but because the world made it so, because history is written by those who survive it, and she survived long enough to become fiction. Centuries later, we still ask, was Elizabeth Báthory guilty? Some say the charges were exaggerated, that the testimonies were gathered under torture, that rival nobles wanted her lands, that she was a woman punished for being powerful, unmarried, and wealthy in a world run by men. There may be truth in that. It's possible the numbers were inflated, possible the bloodbath myths were embellished, possible the final tally of victims was closer to dozens than hundreds. But even if all of that is true, even if the legends are half wrong, what remains is still unbearable. Because dozens is enough, one is enough. And it wasn't just the death, it was the deliberate machinery of cruelty, the chambers, the silence, the obedience of others. Whether she was a scapegoat or a sadist, or both, the truth is simple. Elizabeth Báthory thrived in a system built to protect her. And that system still exists in different forms. So when we ask if she was a monster, we should also ask who built the cage and who held the key. Welcome to the end, not just of Elizabeth Báthory's life, but of a legacy built on bones. She died alone, behind stone, no crowd, no noose, no justice, just silence. And yet, centuries later, she's still here, in movies, in novels, in YouTube thumbnails. Her name speaks louder than those she silenced, because history does not remember the screaming, only the silence that followed it. Elizabeth Báthory became a vampire in legend. But in truth, she was something far more terrifying, a human being given absolute power, and no reason not to use it. Her story isn't a gothic fairy tale. It's a blueprint, a warning that monsters aren't born in crypts or conjured in moonlight. They're built with silence, with privilege, with permission. And if we forget that, if we let the blood become metaphor, the horror become fashion, the killer become a brand, then we've learned nothing. And the next Elizabeth Báthory may not wear a crown. She might wear a badge or a uniform or a smile, but she'll count on the same silence. Don't give it to her.